Hey guys, Youngblood with you, and I know it's been a little bit since the patch dropped, and I'm sure you're expecting me to cover the tank, or the tonk, depending on your preferred vernacular. But I wanted to make sure I got some really good testing in, as well as just making sure I got a unique perspective on the ship. One of the people in my organization is a experienced tanker, and their designated vehicle was an M1A1 Abrams. Which I think when you look at the Nova compared to the Abrams, there's a lot of similarities that really come in. So I will end this with his perspectives on the vehicle because I think it's an interesting take. But let's just talk about the tank a little bit because I think it is interesting to see what we actually have. So the tank. 3-person crew, essentially. It's very spacious on the inside, and you can fit multiple people in there. But as far as people that have jobs, you've got your driver, you've got your co-pilot, which should have most of the jobs or most of the duties available as the driver, in addition to be able to entering the remote turret, which can control the two bulldogs on top. So you basically have two size 2 laser repeaters on the top. You can customize that and put on two, Gatling guns or distortion cannons or whatever you want to. Those weapons are customizable. The main firepower for the tank, which can be used from the driver, but is probably better suited used in the dedicated gunner seat, which is in kind of the middle of the tank, is a size 5. It's known as the Slayer. It is a size 5 ballistic cannon, and it seems to be kind of like a sabot round. As far as what this gun really does, it's got 5,200 DPS. Alpha damage is 26,000. So when you really look at that, you have to say, well, I've got about 12 rounds per minute. 26,000 divided by the 50, or divided by the timing there gets you to what your DPS really is. The reason that number is important is when you look at the HP of the tank itself. The tank has more than that, so you're not going to one-shot a tank in most situations. The turret has 20,000 health though. So when your singular shot can put out 26,000, it means that you can take off the turret, which also has the other size 2s on it, so you eliminate all of the incoming threat possible. So you can effectively one-shot the effectiveness out of another tank, as long as you get a good shot on the target. That health pool is generally shared though. So again, a one-shot hit on the turret will basically disable the tank for all intents and purposes. That Slayer, though, that size 5, it's got a general range of about 2,400 meters, give or take just a little bit, according to Urkel. I haven't tested much beyond that, but it seems to be about accurate. The major problem there, though, is when you're talking about a target that far out, even with a pip, when you do not have a zoom option on your gun, it's a really hard ask to hit something at very long ranges. In addition to that, you've got a very slow traveling round. It's 935 meters per second. And if you're familiar with the weapons in the game, that is very much on the low end of what you would expect for a round that's traveling and doing a lot of damage. So it's not out of the line of some of the other ballistic cannons we see. I think when we look at like the C788, for example, typically you see about 1,000 meters per second. So it's a little bit slower than that. But when you're talking about the distances, if you're at max range, it's entirely possible you miss because minor movements at that range are going to throw off your pip. So with that in mind, it's still an incredibly powerful weapon. You can basically one-shot anything that's about a freelancer or below. Things get a little bit more interesting, though, because of the amount of time it takes to get a new round ready to fire. You've got about 5 seconds between your shots. And when you have about 5 seconds between your shots, something like an FR 66, 76, 86, like those faster recharging shields, they typically come up in under 4 seconds. So unless the shields drop completely, which they don't, it's not persistent damage from a main cannon, you're going to see that changes the equation. So for example, in the stock setup, a Hercules, a big ship, you can basically kill in 3 shots. That being said, if you take that Hercules and put an FR-86 on there, or 2 of them, they recharge too fast for you to be able to take them down. You will continue to pummel that ship, and this is a ballistic round, so it will pass through the shields and make impact on the hull. But, that shield is still taking a lot of that damage equation out of your DPS. So it's hard to really say, this is a one-shot kill, this is a two-shot kill, this is a three-shot kill, because the components on the ships make a difference. That being said, Freelancer and below, you can pretty much get in one shot. Anything that's bigger than that, it's entirely dependent on the components that they have on board and how it reacts overall. As far as signatures are concerned, ground vehicles are really mostly useful because, for things that aren't in the game yet, which is going to be, questionable atmospheric conditions, challenging, visibility concerns, caves. But also, the perk that a lot of people don't really think about when it comes to ground vehicles is ground vehicles don't have much of a signature. And when there's not much of a signature, it means that you can be surprised by a ground vehicle. And the tank, while it's interesting because you don't get the ability to point straight up, you kind of got like a 30-degree angle or so that you can angle at. It means that you can target ships that are coming in on a low trajectory, but if somebody's coming right down on you, you're kind of a little bit hosed. That low signature, though, means that you are relatively masked unless somebody's right on top of you. Now, for comparison's sake, if you look at other ground vehicles, EM is the one that most people look at, so we'll look at that here. The Cyclone MT, 435 on EM. Super low. You can hardly target a Cyclone outside of like 500 meters. A Ballista is about 1187 for their EM. The tank comes in at 2790. So you're basically putting out a significantly higher electromagnetic signature in the tank, more than double of what the Ballista is. So that does tend to favor the Ballista laying in wait and having missiles ready to go. There is a balance equation, though, because the Ballista is firing missiles. You have countermeasures for that. The tank, which is firing, just a ballistic round, you can't counter that. I mean, you can move, but, by the time you see it, the round's coming in and you register that, it could be problematic. So the tank has a certain weight and see what happens type of benefit to it. Overall, I really like the tank. It's really well designed. I will say that my overall opinion on the tank is probably about what it was before. I have a hard time seeing the value in this tank in a world where we have ships, airships, that bring significantly more firepower and are not restricted to the ground like a tank is. So if I know there's a tank target down there, I can come in with my saber, stick directly above it. There's not a lot I can do, and I'm going to wax it really easily. So again, it's a long-term play. How does the game develop? What situations do you use it in? And what I would say is, you're probably not going to see a situation in this game where you have the large-scale tank-on-tank battles. You're not going to have, 10 tanks versus 10 tanks. It doesn't make sense because we could come in with airships. We could come in with, missile boats. We could come in with, rocket pods. It doesn't matter. If I can get above you and you can't get a shot, it's not going to apply. Where I think it's interesting is when you start talking about, like, the bunker missions. Some ships, some pilots, skill level, loadout, whatever. It's easier or harder to deal with the turrets that are in place. Ground vehicles are not typically targeted by the turrets. So if that ends up being the case long term, bringing a tank along may be a really good option. Now, are you going to bring a Hercules? You're going to land in an outpost. You're going to pick up a Nova. You're going to go to a tank to evict illegal occupants for 20,000 credits? Probably not. That's a lot of work for not a lot of money. But I think what you can see is long term, when you have more base types, more outpost types, and the risk reward, the planning, all of that, the cost, whether it's money or time, that will start changing the equation based on what the reward is for accomplishing that mission. So maybe somebody's sitting in a stronghold. I'm impervious to air assault. Now it's time to bring in the tank. So it's not a unworthy vehicle. I'm glad it's in the game. I just have a hard time with seeing how it fits into where we are today. So beyond that, I think I already mentioned, we've got I've got the org mate that's a M1A1 Abrams guy. And his perspective overall is that he likes it. Overall, he feels like it slides a lot more, kind of the driftiness of it, which is very real. The second you hit the acceleration, you're kind of sliding and drifting along. That in itself is not super realistic. When like an Abrams tank, when you start moving, you feel the chunks of each tread or each kind of groove on the tread hitting the pavement or hitting the sand or whatever it is. That being said, when you get up to about 40 and you're on asphalt, and if it's wet, you are going to drift. So it kind of depends. Now, the caveat that he gave, though, is kind of a humorous one. He's got very limited experience in different gravities. All of our tank experience is on Earth. So what does a big-ass tank feel like on another planet? We don't really know. Hurston is very similar to Earth in its gravity, so when you drive on Hurston and you're still sliding, it's safe to say that things are a little bit different. Overall, he thinks it looks fantastic. It looks like a state-of-the-art tank. He feels like it needs a brake because when you're on a hill, it does kind of roll forward or roll backward when you're not really ready for it to do that. You could disengage the drivetrain and kind of counter that to some degree, but it's limited in what actually happens. As far as this thing goes, it feels like you just kind of jump off the line. The acceleration is really strong. And I was curious, what is that experience like in an Abrams? Because an Abrams has a gigantic engine, 1,500 horsepower or something like that. But it also has a lot of mass. And so I asked, what is that like? And he said, well, an Abrams does accelerate really quickly. If you're not bracing yourself, or especially during like gear changes, you can smack your head pretty good. So the quick moving of the tonk isn't crazy. One thing that's really beneficial here is that the barrel, which you can retract by hitting the P button, actually means that you have a significantly easier situation for transportation. On an Abrams, for example, you have to basically spin it around and point towards a corner in order to fit in some of the Galaxies and other ships that are actually hauling these things around. One of the most interesting things for me on this was his view on the view. He said the view is incredible because you have this big window, you've got this viewport, whatever it is. You compare that to a modern tank today, like an Abrams, what you have is almost these little like periscopes. You've got a center, a right, and a left, and those are really kind of embedded with like thick ballistic glass. And that's how you see where you're going. Now, the gunner has a camera that has thermal options, which is something we obviously don't have in the game today, and something I think we obviously want because it's current day technology and it's not represented 900 years in the future. But as far as like the driver on the tank, they technically have the option to slide in like a little night vision insert, but it's complicated to do so. And where these types of engagements typically happen, you have to think about like the Middle East. You're either on the road where there's typically lights, or you're fighting in the desert and there's not a lot of clouds in that environment, so you have a lot of moonlight, and then you don't really need that night vision scope. So I think night vision and thermal are things we're all kind of begging for. Like, these are things that are current day technology. Let us use them. But it's not currently in the game, so we'll see where that goes. Beyond that, I think when you look at just some of the mechanics of it all, he said that the steering wheel on the Abrams is like a T handle. It's kind of close in front of you, and then it's almost got like this motorcycle grip with a throttle on either side that you kind of roll back to go, or roll forward to potentially reverse, and then you kind of have the T handle that you can pivot and steer. So it's a big switch to be able to have a kind of just the overall throttle / steering wheel that's on the Nova. It doesn't necessarily jive with what we see today, but you wouldn't necessarily expect it to before. One thing that he was interested in, though, was like as far as the transmission changes. And again, this is current day technology versus future. But he said that when you change the transmission, the gears, and you switch what's actually happening, it feels like the actual tank like jumps or it lurches, especially if you're shifting gears while in motion, which if you've ever driven a manual transmission, you would know is kind of the expectation. He says that the Nova feels very floaty, almost like it hovers, and it doesn't have that massive feel to it. And just from my driving of it and what I was expecting it to feel like, I 100% agree. It very much is a drifty, floaty vehicle. It doesn't feel like it's got the weight that you would expect it to. And this isn't a hover bike. This is a tracked vehicle, so it shouldn't necessarily feel the way that it does. One thing that I think is interesting here is from like the perspective of actually spending a significant amount of time in a tank. And he said he really wished the Abrams had this much room in it because it feels comfortable. He said that it is weird that you don't have a hatch to go up top, but with this being a space game, being a little bit more sealed up is important, so that's kind of logical. He said that it feels really nice to have an internal weapons rack because inside an Abrams, he would typically have to either keep his weapon, his rifle, in his lap, or it would be slapped in a box on the top. Standard issue for a tanker a lot of times is a sidearm. So this does feel like it gives you more options if you were to transition into FPS combat. As far as just general like combat strategy, tanks never really go anywhere alone. So it's always 2 tanks in a wing, or maybe you have 4 tanks in a group with 2 wings that are supporting each other. And that probably speaks a little bit to how you should play to stay safe and be more effective with shielded targets, because you can offset shots and make sure that you're burning down shields and getting that good hull damage, which you really need. Going back to the internals of the ship a little bit, he said that it's really nice that the entire Nova crew is inside the hull of the tank and nobody's actually sitting in the turret. And if you saw what I mentioned earlier, the turret can get blown off, which is problematic. And in the situation of like life or death, the hull of a tank is a significantly safer place to be. So having everybody there is much better overall. And then from like a personal perspective, sitting in the Nova, in an Abrams all by yourself in the bottom while your 2 gunners are actually sitting in the basket, part of the actual turret, it can get a little bit lonely down there. So having your friends riding along with you a little bit closer is pretty beneficial outside of the safety factors. It's interesting because we both had a similar thought here. The Nova feels like it's really blending the best things about a Bradley and an Abrams, because you have more room on the inside, which is reminiscent of the Bradley, but the exterior feels more like an Abrams. And it is nice having the options to bring people in and potentially, save them from the environment to some degree. One thing that he said would be really nice on an Abrams would be to have countermeasures, because things happen in war that you want to be able to react to. The Abrams does not actually have, active countermeasures. What it has is smoke, and it has a shitload of it apparently, enough to smoke out a field. So, that's a different type of countermeasure. It really feels almost more like a proactive measure. So it depends. I think it feels like a slight upgrade in some degree. But it really depends on the situation that you're in. From a weapon perspective, an Abrams has a main cannon, a 50 cal, and 2 240s. The main cannon is similar enough. The 2 size 2s seem to be a slight firepower upgrade over a 50 cal, but it does feel that it's lacking the gunner, or the gunner on the turret has no coax or that additional machine gun that can help with doing like anti-personnel work. So, you're a little bit more reliant on a full crew to get the job done. Having missiles on board is obviously a huge addition that, something like an Abrams doesn't really have. So again, it's a different animal, but when you actually look at like the main cannons and what it brings, both the Abrams and the Nova both have, similar sized rounds, and they both carry 40 rounds of main cannon ammo, which means they're very similar in their loadouts. One last distinction here is that the Nova has the fire extinguisher on board. The Abrams, which is 900 years in the future, actually has an integrated halon system for fire suppression, so that seems to be more advanced than what we have in the game. That being said, A halon system does mean that you can't actually breathe the environment that you're in. I know that from server rooms and technology. If this halon system goes off, you have to get the hell out of there. Otherwise, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. So it's just kind of a different odds and ends. So that's kind of the tanker's perspective. I agree with a lot of what he had to say. Overall, the tank feels really good. I'm glad it's in the game. It performs well. It's a fun new dynamic. And I think when you start talking about combining, a tank with a ballista, with airships that are going to kind of combine arms, that's where the benefit of this comes in. Now, until Theaters of War comes in or the Persistent Universe really changes, we don't have that environment to really test it and feel it, but you can almost see the writing on the wall of how things are going to go. So that's it. Hopefully you guys appreciated this intake or this input. Hopefully you guys appreciated the perspective and the information. If you guys have questions, please let me know soon. Otherwise, have yourselves a wonderful day. Stay tuned for more content coming soon, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care.